Here's our shock, and we've got 2 springs. This is a dual spring system, not a dual rate. Now, at the top here, you can see we have our tender spring, which is a much shorter spring than the main. Now, the reason behind this design is our top tender spring is supposed to absorb those first initial impacts, those small choppy bumps, which is going to give us a more plush ride. And then as we get into some of the bigger obstacles, more aggressive terrain, our main spring is going to be doing most of the work. Now, the problem that most people are encountering is once we're all loaded up in our machine, we've got our cooler, passenger, and whatever gear we're taking with us, we increase the overall spring preload on the machine, which is going to take away the tender's ability to give us that plush and good ride. Now, we can't take credit for coming up with this idea. We found this actually while browsing through some forums, and we thought we'd give it a shot, and turns out it works pretty good. So what we'll be doing today is we're going to take off the rear tender spring. We're going to get rid of it. We're going to take our front tender spring, move this one to the rear shock, and then we're going to grab a tender spring off of a XP4 1000 4-seater at the front tender spring, and we're going to put it on our front shock. So let's get into it. I'll show you how it's done. All right, now before we get started with the spring swap, something I wanted to point out to you real quick is here at the rear of the machine on our rear shock, you'll notice our tender spring is almost fully compressed. This isn't going to help us out much with that plush ride, so this is going to be one of a few reasons to do this spring swap. First thing we need to do is get the machine off of the ground, so we need to elevate it so the tires aren't touching the ground. Next, we can pull the tires from the machine. Oh, there we go. Yes. For the front shock, we're going to need some tools. We've got a 15mm ratchet with socket, and then we've got our 15mm open-end wrench. We'll remove our bottom bolt, our top bolt, then we'll bring a jack around, support the lower A-arm, and then we'll pull our shock free. For the rear shock, we're going to need a few tools. We've got a 18mm socket with driver and an 18mm box open-end wrench. Now you'll notice our mud guards are on the back side of the shock. They should be on the front. Now we have to mount ours on the back of it because we have aftermarket trailing arms. If you're running stock trailing arms at home, make sure this is facing the front when you reinstall it. So we're going to pull our base bolt. We'll loosen the top, get the nut off of there. Before we pull the upper bolt on the shock itself, we need to remove some parts up top here to get this reservoir out of the way. So here I'll be using a T25 Torx bit. We've got a little bit of fascia, a little fascia panel that we have to pull off. We'll get this out of the way. Get these 2 bolts that fasten the reservoir to the frame. We'll get that pulled off. Now we can take our shock's reservoir, route it through this hole here, and we've got this down and out of the way. Now we've got our top bolt loosened. We pulled the nut off. So now we can pull the bolt free, like so. Then remove the shock, take it to the bench. All right, so before we begin, there's just a few things I'd like to cover with you. Over here, we've got some tools that are going to be necessary for the swap. First, we've got our tape measure. This will be used to measure our spring preload length that we have currently set. So when we install the new tender springs, we can get it back to where it was. Next, we've got a pen and paper to record those results. Our spanner wrench that should come stock with your machine and its toolkit. Then we've got a 17mm box open-end wrench, flathead screwdriver, Torx T25, and some spring compressors from Tusk, really useful tool, some spray lubricant, and then lastly we've got our tender spring here. Now to start, we're going to take our front shock, we're going to place it into our vise here with soft jaws. Once we get that mounted, we can grab our tape measure, take a measurement. So right here I'm measuring from the top of the adjuster to where the threads end on the top side of the shock body. So right here it looks like I've got about 2 1/8 inches. So I'll record that on my piece of paper. And then we can begin to remove the preload nut here. So take our spanner tool and start removing it. Now, depending on how dirty your machine was, it may be a good idea to go through, clean up these threads, and it wouldn't hurt to use a little bit of lubricant to assist in the removal. Okay, so once we get that nut backed all the way up to the top of the shock's body, then we're going to take the spring compressors and we're going to use these to compress our spring. Now before we do that, we'll take our flathead screwdriver and we're going to move the bottom out bumper. Some of them can be stubborn. Kind of helps to have a flathead screwdriver there to pry it up, to get it up out of the way. We'll move this so that we can have room to pull off the spring retainer. So we'll take and place our spring compressor onto the spring, get one on both sides, then we'll start cranking it down. And this is going to compress the spring just enough so that we have enough clearance to remove the spring's retainer. So once our spring compressors have compressed the spring far enough, we should have enough clearance to pull down and out of the spring retainer, just like that. Pull this assembly off, pull the lower spring. Pull off the nylon spacer, and then our tender spring. So this is the old one off the front. We'll be taking this, placing it on the rear. We're going to take our new from the XP4 1000 four-seater, slide it into place. We'll put our nylon spacer back in. Now on this nylon spacer, you can see there on the front of it, it has an arrow indicating its orientation. So it looks like this is pointing down, so we want to have the longer side of the spacer pointing towards the base of the shock. So we'll slide this into place. Take our lower spring, slide it back on, followed by our spring retainer. Now something important to note when reassembling all of this is that the bottom of your spring, you have where the coil ends, right here. We want to make sure that where this ends is 180 degrees on the other side of where the spring retainer's opening is. So if our spring ends here, we want to position our retainer so it's facing 180 from it. Remove the spring compressor. So now that we've got our new spring on there, we can tighten our adjusting nut here, set it back to the spring's preload, and this will be ready to be reinstalled on the machine. Okay, looks like we've got our preload set to where it needs to be. We can pull this one out of the vise and get started on the next. All right, now onto the rear spring. We're going to take our Torx T25. We're going to remove the mud guard from the base of the rear shock. With the mud guard removed, we can take our measurement of our spring's preload, or the shock's preload rather, from the top of the adjuster nut to where the threads stop. It's right here, we're sitting at about 6 3/4 inches. So we'll write that down for the rear. We can take some lube. We're going to spray the threads down. And we'll take our spanner tool and start to back this off. Now we don't have to remove this nut completely, or at least take it all the way to the top of the shock body. You'll see once we get it so far, we'll have plenty of room to remove the lower spring retainer. Okay, so once we've got this far enough out of the way, again, we need to take our bottom out cushion here and move that up the shock shaft. So to do that, I'm just going to take my screwdriver, wedge it in here to grab it, maybe a little difficult, and I'm being careful not to scratch the shaft itself. All right, we got that up out of the way. Slide our springs up. We'll pull our retainer. This is going to be what holds our mudguard on, and then the retainer itself. Pull off the lower. Spring divider, spring spacer, and the tender spring. So as you can see in comparison to these two springs, our old rear, it's pretty dainty, pretty small. So we're just going to take this, replace that tender spring. Spacer. And we'll put on the lower. Lastly, the spring retainer itself. So you may have to mess with this a little bit as you're going together with setting the preload. Just remember, you've got to have where this spring coil ends 180 degrees from the retainer's opening. It's always good to make your final measurements before you get too much preload put on the shock itself. If you have too much preload, it's almost impossible to adjust the spring's retainer to make sure it's in the proper position. So keep that in mind when you're going together with the shock. So once we've got our spring preload adjuster set in about the right position, take our tape measure, make our measurement. Looks like right there we're sitting right at about 6 3/4 inches. So once we've got that set, we need to move our bump stop, put it back down into the base. Then we can reinstall our mudguard. Okay, so it looks like we're finished up here at the bench. So we'll take these, get them reinstalled on the machine. Now we can take our front shock and install it on the machine. When you set these bolts to torque, for this particular machine, this is a 2014 XP 1000 two-seater. And the service manual indicates that we should be setting each one of these top bolts and bottom bolts to 42 foot-pounds. So once we get this set up and installed, we'll move on to the rear. Now we can move on to installing the rear shock. So to install this, I'm going to set it into its location, set the top bolt through, and I'll take the shock's reservoir, route it up through the body, and mount it to the frame. Then we can come back to the base of the shock, set the bottom bolt, and then we're going to torque them to spec. The shock mounting bolts for this particular machine are 70 foot-pounds of torque. So when you're doing this on your machine at home, if you've got something different, be sure to reference your service manual for those proper specifications. All right, with the shocks mounted to the machine, we can move on to installing the tires. We're going to start with the rear tire and get that installed. Now we can move to the front and install the front tire. When installing your wheels, be sure to reference your service manual for the appropriate torque spec for the lug nuts. Once we have all of our parts put back on the machine, we can lower it to the ground. And the last step here is to take one more measurement. So we're at the back of the machine here, and we're going to take a quick measurement. This is for the front to rear bias. Now, the front needs to sit higher than the rear by about 1/2 inch, but no more than 3/4. So we're going to measure off of the floor to the bottom of our skid plate, and it looks like we're sitting at about 13.5 inches. So then we can move to the front, take our measurement, and then make adjustments if necessary. Now, while we're here at the back of the machine, I want you to take a look at the rear shock. Take a look at the tender spring. We are no longer experiencing a bound coil. So this is awesome for the machine. It's going to give us a much improved ride, especially when we've got it loaded down with all of our gear for the day. So now that we've got the rear measured, we can move on to the front. Just going to take a measurement here off the floor to the bottom of the skid plate. Now, skid plate's usually the best place to take this measurement because it's our our flat level plane. So in the rear we were at 13.5 inches, in the front we're sitting at 14.25. So that's going to give us our 3/4 bias. So in the front we're 3/4 of an inch taller than the rear. So this is going to be necessary for your machine's performance and handling, especially when you get into some of that faster terrain.